My name is Raj Vancia, and I am one of the TAs for CS6440, and today we'll be going over SMART on FHIR. So for today's session, some of the learning objectives include: you'll get a basic understanding of what SMART on FHIR is, you'll learn why it's important in the field and why we're using it in the class, and at the end, I'll show you a tutorial of how to set up your own app with a sandbox environment. We'll be using two sandbox environments. One is the Cerner sandbox, and we'll be also using SMART on FHIR's own sandbox environment. So the SMART in SMART on FHIR stands for Substitutable Medical Reusable Technology. Substitutable basically means that you could use different third-party apps, and you could choose what works best for you. SMART was developed in around 2010, and it came out of the Boston Children's Medical Hospital as well as the Harvard Medical School. SMART is a set of standards that allows different third-party apps to integrate and authenticate within the EHR. And one of the advantages of SMART is that it could be used across different platforms, such as Cerner and Epic. Some of the open standards that it utilizes include OAuth 2 for authentication, and for identity management, it uses OpenID Connect. This allows for the user to sign in and provide some context, such as their NPI number or other basic demographic information. SMART also provides some robust client libraries using common programming language such as JavaScript, Python, and iOS. It utilizes modern web technologies and can be used to develop both web and mobile apps. And one of the main advantages of using SMART is that it can be directly embedded within EHRs. This greatly helps support better workflow integration for providers. Before we get into the details of SMART on FHIR, I'll show you what are some existing apps that are already out there using this technology. I highly recommend you to explore these apps within the app library on SMART on FHIR's main website. This will give you a better understanding on how these apps are used in a wide range of different use cases. This library includes both commercial and open source applications. So now launch the SMART on FHIR app gallery. You can see the different types of apps, such as one geared towards population health, risk calculation, and data visualization. Next, we'll be exploring one of the SMART on FHIR apps, the bilirubin chart. Here we could get a quick synopsis of what this app is about. Today we are going to be testing out the bilirubin app. This app can help calculate a patient's risk for hyperbilirubinemia. It's intended to help prevent jaundice in newborns. So when we click on Try App, it will launch the simulated EHR. So as this is a provider-facing app, we're going to be using the practitioner logon. Now select your patient. So now the data is presented both in tabular and in chart form. It clearly shows a risk calculation based on the bilirubin levels and the postnatal age. The different colors represents the different risk levels, and you can see how this patient fares. As you can see from the short example that we just went over, you can understand now why SMART on FHIR is being adopted widely within the industry. It helps try to solve the interoperability problem with the ideal goal of having a rich set of ecosystem of apps that can be used in multiple healthcare systems and on top of different EHR vendors. And SMART is not just for clinicians. There are also apps geared towards patients, which allows them to view their medical data. This helps with patient engagement and allows the patients to be more involved with their healthcare. Also, one of the big pushes for the adoption of SMART on FHIR is that it helps fulfill the requirement for Meaningful Use 3. MU3 is one of CMS's policy that requires organizations to provide patients with access to their healthcare data. Lastly, it provides clinicians with more options on what types of apps they can use, so they're not locked in to only what their main EMR vendor can provide. So we'll be using SMART within the class and throughout your projects. It helps provide a common platform for showcasing your apps. And also, a lot of your mentors work in healthcare systems that are already using SMART. Working with SMART on FHIR in the class helps demonstrate some real-world use cases. Also, while you're developing your app for your project, SMART on FHIR provides some robust client libraries, which makes it a lot easier to retrieve data from the FHIR server. Below is a basic OAuth workflow for the app that you are going to be testing out. The app makes a request to the FHIR server to get what the authorization URL server is. The app then sends an authorization request to the auth server with some of the context parameters such as the patient ID and what type of resources it wants to access. Once validated, the authorization server sends back an authorization code. This code can then be exchanged with an access token. Once the app has that access token, it can then make FHIR resource calls against the FHIR server. However, it can only access the patient that is in context and to FHIR resources defined by the access token. For this homework assignment, you'll be making the following SMART on FHIR app. This app should run on both the Cerner Smart Sandbox as well as the SMART on FHIR sandbox as well. Most of the code template has already been provided to you. For this homework, you'll be adding a few more features to this app. The first two features are adding height and weight, and the second feature is adding the ability to add an annotation to a weight observation. So you can see it working here. And the last feature that you'll be adding is a list of medication requests for this patient. These medications can be either active or stopped. When you add an annotation for the weight observation, you want to make sure you have the author field as well as the date time field programmed into your code. So here we could show you how this works. So if I go to inspect element, I have this observation ID for this one weight observation. I can then go to the open sandbox for the Smart Health IT, and this is the sandbox that we use to pull in this patient's data. So I can look up the observation by using the ID that was generated. So here we could kind of see, what patient this is associated to, that's body weight, and here we could kind of see the different tests annotations that we added. So you could see here in the note field that I added a few other tests here, and you can see that the author is my name as well as the time. And one thing that you could also look at is the daytime format. You have to make sure that it's in this standard format with the time zone. This lab assignment has been adapted from the Cerner Smart on FHIR tutorial you could find here. This is a great tutorial that can provide you a lot more detail in terms of how to set up a Smart on FHIR app with the Cerner Code Console. However, the base code that Cerner has provided, it essentially works on FHIR version R2, and it also uses an old client.js. So the lab that we provided uses the new FHIR R4 version as well as the new client.js package. So the first thing to get your app set up, you want to use GitHub Pages. We'll be using the github.godtech.edu site. So we could go to this repository that I've created, and then you could do a clone and download. So you could download as a zip, or if you have the GitHub desktop app, you could open it there as well. So I normally select download as zip. Next, you want to create your own repository so that you can make code edits. So here, you want to put lab.-3-2 as your repo name. As you can see, I already have this repo created. So for testing purposes, I'll just select test. Again, you want to select public for GitHub to allow you to see it through GitHub Pages. And then you want to select create repository. So next, what you'll be doing is you'll be creating a folder locally on your computer, and then you can then load and copy all those files from the repo that I've created into your folder and follow these commands to push the code to your repo so that you can program locally. So once you have your code loaded into your repo, you should see something like this. So we have a lot of the templating HTML as well as the CSS and JavaScript mainly created for you. So the next step is to set up GitHub pages. So you want to go to Settings, and you can scroll all the way down, and you want to select the source. So you want to select the master branch of your GitHub repo. And this might take a few minutes, but then your site will be published here at this following URL, and let's test it out. So you can see here that your app is publicly available now through this URL. And if you set up GitHub pages correctly, you should be able to see this web page. And you could also go to health.html to see the healthy sign.
For this lab, we'll be deploying our app on two Smart on FHIR sandbox environments. The first one will be the Cerner sandbox. To start developing your app, let's go to the code console. So for Cerner, you actually have to create an account if you don't have one already. So let's create an account. So here, we could just fill out all your information. You'll be provided an email indicating that your account has been verified. So I already have an account, so let me log on to that one. So once you log on to your account, you should see a developer portal like this. So for this lab, let's create a new app by clicking the New App button. So for here, let's give it an app name such as lab-3-2. Now for your Smart Launch URI, that's going to be the URI of your app that will authenticate your application with the Smart on FHIR sandbox. So let's get that URI. And in this case, it's the launch.html file. And for your redirect URI, it'll just be the root of your GitHub pages that you created. That way it can access the index.html file that will load your app. So for this app type, we'll be selecting provider. And this is an important feature that you have to make sure that we create. We select R4 for this Smart on FHIR app. And that's the newer supported version of FHIR. And we do want to select that this app will require OAuth 2. And this is a really neat feature that Smart on FHIR enables. It's called scopes. So scopes essentially limits access of the app for certain FHIR resources. So in this application, for testing purposes, we'll select observation read as well as patient read. For your homework assignment, you will actually have to find out which scopes you would need in order to add those additional features. So once you're all done, let's create a register app. So as you can see, the app has now been registered in your code console. So now let's go back to it. And now you can see a client ID has been generated. So for this client ID, you want to make sure that you edit your code to include this client ID so that your app can authenticate with the Cerner code sandbox. So let's go and look at where that has to be updated. So go to your launch.html file, and then we'll scroll all the way down, and then you can see in this client ID, you should update that to match what's in your code console. And here you can also see the scopes that have been identified to what your app is authorized to access. So now let's go back to the developer portal. You can select on your newly created app. Now we could begin testing here once you updated your client ID on your launch.html file. So we have a list of patients that Cerner has provided. One of the things to note is that a lot of these patients might not have observations that we'll be testing during this application. So a good one to start with is Nancy Smart that has some observation, and then we could select No for showing the demographic banner. Let's click Next to test it out. And here you can find your username and password for this test app. Let's click Launch. And you can see how this app pulled in the patient's information, their name, demographic information. You can see this patient doesn't have too many observations. It does have HDL. And here, this is your template code, so you're going to have to update, the medication request as well as height and weight to pull in that FHIR data. One thing to note that we've seen with the Cerner Code sandbox is that it might take about 10 to 15 minutes once you register your app to actually show up. So if you do see an error, just give it some time, and then if not, feel free to reach out on Piazza. Now let's see one of the main advantages of Smart FHIR in action. The next step is we're going to be using another simulated EHR and Smart on FHIR sandbox. This showcases how Smart on FHIR can help aid in interoperability. We won't change any of the app's code, and let's see if it launches on this new sandbox. So let's go to the launch.smarthealthit.org launcher page. So this is kind of similar to the Cerner Code console, but they do have some different options. And this sandbox is also open, so that allows you to not really have to worry about updating any of your client ID on your launch.html file. So the launch type we're going to be selecting is provider EHR launch. One of the things that Ellie, the other TA, found out, a shout out to her, we want to deselect the simulate launch within EHR user interface. If you do have that selected, it does cause an iframe issue. So for the FHIR version that we'll be using is R4. And here for the patient scope, we can select a patient that we want to test with. The Smart FHIR patient browser is a really cool app that you should feel free to kind of explore different patients and look at their different observations and different resources that they have available. So you can see here they have about 11 observations for laboratory and about 30 for vital signs. So let's see what this patient. So now you don't have to select anything for a provider. We can enter that in later when the app launches. And you want to select none for error testing. So for app launch URL, you want to select the same HTML file that we use, and this will authorize your Smart on FHIR app. So let's test it out. So bring you into a sign-in page. This is just a test physician, so you can log in. And then let's select a test patient we want to test with. And you can see that with this next test patient, we pulled in the demographic information. They have some blood pressure values as well. And you can see one of the main advantages is that we didn't change any of the code, and we were able to launch our Smart FHIR application on a different sandbox. So now let's review the code template in a little bit more detail to help you with your assignment. So if you go to the index.html file, this is essentially what your app is displaying. As you can see, we have a banner bar with the patient's name, gender, and date of birth. And then this ID is basically used to then dynamically update the HTML values from the JavaScript file that we'll show you later on. Again, we have already created for you the HTML templates for height, weight, systolic and diastolic blood pressures, as well as the lab results for LDL and HDL. And again, we have the basic UI elements for adding the annotation for the weight observation. So we have the input bar as well as the add button. And then lastly, we have the medication request with a list of the different medication results. And one thing that we've also helped to develop is we have two different script tags. This one, the get dash data, is used for the app if it's going to be used in a sandbox environment. This script we could actually utilize. We create our own FHIR client instance locally, so that it's a little bit easier to test. All right, so now let's look at the get data JavaScript file that could be found under the lib.js folder. So first we have a couple of helper functions to help you get started. And this has been adapted from the Cerner Smart and FHIR guide. So the first one is to kind of get the patient. So it will take the patient information and then basically strip out all the information to provide the patient name. And here we have another function, helper function, to take that patient information and then display that on our HTML page. Same thing with the medication list. So we already kind of developed some of the logic that allows you to add, dynamically a list of the medication requests. However, in this lab, you're going to have to provide the data that actually goes into that function so that you could pull that different information for different patients. So this function allows you to verify a specific observation value and unit, so you could pull the value as well as the unit from the observation resource and then display it appropriately. And it's a similar function for blood pressure value. So you get systolic and diastolic blood pressures from that observation. And again, this is a function that helps you to initialize a test patient. That makes it a little bit easier when working with the data with your app. Again, you're gonna have to update this to add the additional values here. Again, this is another function that allows you to pass in annotation data so it could display within your app. And the same thing goes for the various vital signs data. So this right here, the fired.oauth2.ready is it's a very important feature of this app. So essentially returns a promise once your Smart and FHIR application has been authenticated with the respective sandbox. So if it does get authenticated, it provides you with a client instance. So that client instance is very powerful for then you to make requests to that FHIR sandbox. And that is utilizing the client.js package, which we'll go into later. So as you can see, this is a basic client request to get patient information. So the way that it works is that we have the patient resource and then we pass it the client ID. So that client ID is, as you probably remember, how we selected a patient for when we started our app within the sandbox. That client ID is passed to your app in this form, so you can access it through .patient.id. And then from here, we can then call this display patient function to then get the respective data. I also added a console log so that when you look at the inspect feature in your browser, you can kind of see the raw data that is being sent. So next we'll create a search parameter so that we could retrieve some observation information. So this is just a way that we can create our own search parameters easily. So in this case, we want to search by the patient ID. We want to return about 100 resources, and we want to sort by date. And then this is important for the observation resources. So we want to return observations that have a code specific for all these various loin codes. So one of the things for your assignment is that you're going to have to find out what the loin codes for the weight and height are in order to retrieve this observation data for you. So now we have a page limit of 0, which will return all of them, and then again, this returns a promise, so that once it's been filled, we can then apply a function to then retrieve that data, and then we can then apply various functions to then process that to have those values display in our app. So a neat feature of the client.js package is this function called bytecode. So essentially what that allows us to do is it allows us to organize the observation results that we have by line codes. So we could just request it from the server once, and then we can then sort it out on the client side of our app. So for this example, we could retrieve the systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure based on its line codes. So next, what we have here is, if it returns like a value for the patient, we can then essentially add that to our patient's instance that we've created. So again, it makes it easier when we're trying to display that within the app. And then once we have all our patients features set, we can then display that within our app here. So the next step is that one of the requirements for this lab is we're going to be adding a medication request results for the patients. So they could be either active or stopped. So it makes it a little bit easier for you guys. So what we have here is just dummy data, and you're definitely going to have to update this to show the dynamic nature of pulling in med requests for different patients. So this is just to kind of get you started here. And this is the same thing that goes with the add weight annotation requirement for this lab. So again, we just have some dummy functions here, which you're going to have to update. But we did kind of provide you some of the JavaScript functionality, such as added event lister. So when you do click that add button, it calls this function for that. So for this lab, we also created the get-data-test JavaScript file. This allows you to test the app locally on your desktop more easily. So one of the things that allows you to do is, instead of having to authenticate against a code sandbox, we could actually create our own FHIR client by using one of the open Smart on FHIR sandboxes. So in this case, we'll be using the Smart Health IT sandbox. And here we could select a patient ID of your liking. So feel free to update this patient ID to whatever one you want to test with. And what this allows you to do is actually create a client instance for your app without having to go through the Smart App Launcher or the Cerner Code console. So let's see it in action here. So I have this locally, and if we go to the index file, you can see that it's still able to query the Smart on FHIR open sandbox and pull in the respective data. So for this lab assignment, we'll be using the client.js JavaScript library. So we'll be specifically using version 2, which is the newest one. So here we can see the docs page. Feel free to explore all these different avenues to get more understanding on this library. It's definitely have some great examples as well as detailed explanations. So we'll click on here for some examples on different methods. So for your homework assignment, one of the tasks that you have to do is update a observation resource to add a annotation to it. You can see for this method, we can pass in data, which would then update the respective FHIR resource.
I hope you enjoyed this tutorial about getting started with Smart on FHIR. And here are some helpful links below.